Now friends, we will discuss that the concept of national security or international security, how we can define or how we can understand the concept of national security. So in that sense, we can take the help of 5 dimension or 5 way to look at the conception of security, and from that perspective we can understand the concept of national security. So in that sense, the first dimension or the first way to look at the concept of security is the origin of threat, from where the threat is coming. So in that sense, friends, we can say that it is the state that gives threat to the international system or to any other state in the international system. So the origin of the threat, it is between state to state, which means that one particular state in the international system is actually threatening the another state in the nation state system, or many other state in the international system, which means that the threat is coming from the state. We can take the example here. If we take the example of South Asia, which means that if there is a rivalry between India and Pakistan, so that means that or the China is threatening to India, Pakistan is threatening to India. So in that sense, the threat is not coming from any other actors in the international system. Rather, it is the state that giving threat to a particular state. That for our discussion, it may be India in that sense. So in that sense, we can say it is the state-centric sort of threat or state-centric conception of security that define the concept of national security. Friend, the another dimension that we can take to define the concept of national security, that is the dimension of nature of threat. So that nature of threat, that again in that conception of national security or state-centric conception of security, we can say that it is the state-centric conception of threat that is coming. That which means that the concept that is, for example, warfare, the concept that is the military forces, the military engagement of the military forces, nuclear policies or the nuclearization, arms race, arms sort of threat. So the state and their strategies, that is the main concern or the another way to look at or one of the important dimension to define the concept of national security. So friends, the another dimension of the security is the response. How the way of response the state is giving, that is another dimension to define or to explain the conception of security. So in the case of response, the response is coming from the state, which means that the state A is threatening to state B. So in that sense, the state, it is the security concern or the security aspect is related to the state, not any other non-state actors, number one. Number two, the nature of the threat, which means that the state-centric strategies, that may be balance of power, collective security, coercive forces, that sort of threat, that sort of approaches or the nature of the threat. So that also define a kind of state-centric conception of security. In case of response, the response is also coming from the either directly by the state or the state created institutions or the values or the law that define the responses to the threat in the international system. So friends, in that case sense, we can say that the unilateral approaches of the state, for example, in case of United States of America's intervention in Iraq, so that sort of things that is defined, which means that the state has the legal authority or the legal rights to respond the threat coming from the enemy state, that we call as the concept of self defense. So under Article 51 of the UN Charter, that empowered the state to go for a kind of coercive approach unilaterally as well in the name of self defense. The another way the state can respond, that it is maybe the collective conception of security that we call as the kind of creation of the United Nations, NATO, and various other similar sort of organization that can also play an important role to maintain international peace and security, and also can avoid and also can give response to the enemy state or the aggressor state. So that response is also a kind of state-centric mechanism or the state-centric sort of strategy to respond the enemy state or the aggressor state in the international system. So the response is again, it is state-centric in nature. So the fourth element or the fourth dimension to look at the conception of security, that is the concept of national security, that who is responsible for providing security. So the response is again state-centric, and who is responsible of that, which means that we can take the example of any state A, that is the victim state or the state, that state is attacked by any other state. In that way, the state A who is attacked by any other enemy state or the aggressor state, then who is responsible in providing security to that particular state. So in that sense, we can say there are various theoretical explanation where the essence of that explanation is that it is the state that is important, or state-centric mechanism which is important, and that is responsible for providing security or to respond the challenges which is coming from the enemy state or any aggressor state. So in that sense, we can say the concept of collective security, balance of power, and that sort of things which means that either the state alone, collectively, or at the institutional level, it is only the state who are responsible to provide security to the international system or to that particular state. It is only the state and state-centric system that are responsible in providing and maintaining security in the international system. So again, it is state-centric. The last dimension to look at the conception of security is the concept of core values or the dimension of core values. Whose core values is actually matters in the definition or in the explanation of security in the domain of international security. So in that sense, it is again a kind of state-centric core values, which means that the protection of the sovereignty of the state, the national independence, means the independence or the freedom of the state, maintaining the territorial integrity and boundary of the state, and also the domestic of the freedom of the sovereignty of the state. So these are the core important values of the state that are important issues in the discourse and discussion of the traditional concept of security that express in terms of state-centric conception of security. So the core values of the state, that is the sovereignty of the state, protection of the physical boundary of the state, or the maintenance of the integrity of the territory of the state, that is the territorial integrity of the state, and also the maintenance and the protection of the core values or the core philosophy of the state. For example, any state stood for any certain values, for example democracy, for example protection of human rights all over the world. So if there is any sort of values, if the state pursuing that, and the state must be free or must be stood for that sort of values, and in that process state must be in a position to protect that sort of values. This is that state-centric values are the dimension to look at to explain the traditional concept of security that define or that express in terms of national conception of security. So this concept of security, that is we called as the state-centric conception of security or the traditional conception of security. So as I said in the discussion, as we discuss in detail about the factors that force the international theories to broaden the scope broaden the scope of the concept of security by including the new dimension of security, that which is expressed in terms of economy, which is expressed in terms of environmental protection, and also which expressed in terms of food security, health security, environmental security, and also the political dimension of security. That is the core dimension or the core traditional conception of the security. So as friends, as we discuss about the conception of globalization, the basic characteristics of globalization, and how that process of globalization, as a result of that, how things in the international system, the issues of international system got changed in a very large extent. So that conception or that forces which occurred in the international system out of the process of globalization, now we see that also impacting the concept of security that defines in terms of state's conception of security, that is the traditional concept of security. So that traditional concept of security that was largely defined in terms of state conception of security, now we define that sort of that concept of security, or transform that concept of security more including or inclusion of the various new dimension of security that we call as the global conception of security or global security. So that global security, to define the concept of global security, we also can take the example, or we can also take the various dimension of security. By that way we also can understand the concept of global security. So that global security, the first parameter in that sense, we can say that the origin of threat. In the case of state-centric security, the origin of threat means the threat is only coming from the state. State A is threatening to state B, and the state A threatened by the state B, which means that it was largely confined or limited to the state conception of origin of the threat. The origin of the means the state is the only propagator, is the only the origin of the threat is only coming from the state. But in the case of global conception of security, the threat is not from external, rather it is also domestic in nature, which means that from external to domestic. In the case of state centric security, it was the external state, external sovereign state that threatened the other state in the international system. But in the case of global conception of security, now we see that in the domestic issues, means within the national boundaries of the state, certain factors are there that also counted as a threat to their citizens or the core values of that particular states as well. So in that sense, we can see the threat is not only coming from the external forces or the external actors, rather the domestic forces or the domestic actors also contributing so far as to creating insecurity in the international system is concerned. So that domestic forces is more basically talks about in terms of what? In terms of humanistic conception of security and non-state conception of security. So in that sense, we can take the example of the various ethnic groups, the rivalry and the violence occurred between the various ethnic groups, and also the various internal displaced migrant people, and also on the basis the violence occurred on the basis of language, on the basis of identity also. So that domestic factors is also very important source, become a very important source so far as creating insecurity in the international system is concerned. And also because of the forces of globalization, that domestic forces which are very important so far as to create insecurity is concerned, that domestic forces also having the linkage to the other area of the nation state system in the international system. So that which means that there is a kind of linkage of the various domestic forces to the external factors also, means the extraterritorial boundaries, that forces also having that sort of potential to spill over. So in that sense, the forces of globalization force the political thinkers to include the domestic factors also, that creating a kind of instability, and also engage in some sort of coercive and violence kind of activities that create a kind of insecurity in the international system. The another the discussion related to the origin of the threat is concerned that from state to global in nature, which means that a kind of, as I said, that there is a kind of in the national conception of security, the threat is only coming from the state, but in the case of global security, we also including the domestic factors as well, the sources that coming from the domestic factors, and that domestic forces or that domestic forces that is happening within the nation, that also has the connection and linkage with the other part of the world as well. So because of that reason, we see a kind of non-state conception of threat also emerging in the discourse of international relation or international security. So friends, we can take the example of that. For example, the issue of migration, the issue of terrorism, the issue of environmental problem. So that kind of ethnic, religious, identity based kind of domestic problem, that also giving threat to the international system, and it is not only giving threat to that particular nations, rather it also having the potential to create a kind of instability to the other part of the world as well. So in that sense, we can take the example of the migrations that the peoples in group migrated from that eastern part of the world to the European nations and also America as well. So we see a kind of various new types of threat, new dimension of threat. For example, the religious based identity kind of threat, and also a kind of ethnic based kind of threat, race based kind of threat, linguistic based kind of threat. So that conception, that conception of security now also including the domestic factors, and also that has the potential to spill over other part of the world as well. So because of that sense, we can say that it is the threat is shifted from state to global in nature. So that is the first dimension to look at the concept of global security, to define the concept of global security. Friends, another important dimension to define or to explain the concept of global security is the nature of threat. So in the case of state centric conception of security, that is the national security, now we define the concept of security which is global in nature, that it shifted from military to comprehensive, which means that as I said that earlier in the discussion, that the concept of security now broadened, which means that it is not the state to state conception of security. It is not the security of a particular state, rather the security, the dimension of the security, also including the various new dimension of the security, for example, environment, poverty, food security, health. So there are various new dimension of the security as well, and that new conception of security, which is non-military in nature, non-political in nature, and which is more economic in nature, more environmental in nature, and more identity based in nature. So because of that reason, and more importantly because of the reason of the environmental issues, and also the non-state actors, the threat coming from the non-state actors, the state conception of security that defined in terms of military conception of strategy, now we see now we need to have the more comprehensive sort of approach, or more comprehensive nature of responses to respond these new sort of threats which is coming from the state and also the non-state actors as well. So the nature of threat is not appeared in terms of military, rather it is also appeared in the non-military sense as well, because of the inclusion of the non-state actors and the non-state factors that also playing a very important role so far as the discussion and debate of the security is concerned in the domain of international security or the global politics is concerned. So that comprehensive, which means that military, that is the state to state, so the presence of international, for presence of terrorist group, the presence of various ethnic based group, the presence of various similar sort of environmental groups and other sort of things are there, that are also very much important or become very much important, that define a new sort of threat, new nature of threat that are there in the discourse of global conception of security, that is the global peace and security. Friends, now we have another dimension to look at the concept of global security or to explain the concept of global security. In that sense, we can take the dimension which is response is concerned, or response in nature, that is the changing responses from military to non-military. So in that we have already discussed about the military conception of responses. So in that sense, in the earlier discussion, that is which is based on state-centric conception of security, that we call as the national security or international security. So that response, the responsibility to give response to that sort of threat was the state. So it is the state that give threat to the state, and it is the state that are responsible to provide security to that particular state and also to the international system. So in the global conception of security, it is not threat only coming from the state to state, and the response is not to the military conception of response to that particular threat. As in the case of global security, we include the state centric security as well as the non-state centric security, which is the humanistic in nature, that is the human centric conception of security, to respond that mixed conception of security, that is the state and non-state concept of security. The international theories explain the responses to that particular threat more in a comprehensive way by including military as well as the non-military sort of strategies to respond that. For example, we can take the example of climate change. So in that sense, it is not the military that are well enough or adequate enough to respond the climate change. The military cannot do anything in that sense. Similarly, in the case, if you take the example of food security, international commerce and business, and the concept of the health consumption, the health security, in that the military cannot do anything to respond that sort of issues that we call as the new risks or global risks. So in that sense, the cooperations among the state requires more and more cooperations among the states are required. In addition to that, the civil societies and the various other strategies we need to take to respond that sort of non-traditional based conception of security. So the engagement of the state, more and more cooperations of the state to respond that sort of non-military sort of strategies that become a more important way to discuss or to understand the new conception of security that we call as the concept of global security. Friends, another dimension of security is the changing responsibility for security, which means that here from national security to common security. In the case of national security, that is the state-based security or traditional security, the responsibility was on the state. It is the state that are responsible, or the state system that are responsible in providing security to the international system. So it was the state who are responsible in the maintenance of international peace and security, the state mechanism, the state structure, the state involvement. Their responses and their strategies was the main conception or the main perspective so far as the responsibility to provide security or to maintain security in the international system. So in the case of global security, that national centric conception of responsibility, that is the state responsibility to provide security or to maintain security, now it is more a kind of the responsibility is not only on the state, rather it is also including the non-state actors as well in the process of providing or maintaining international peace and security. So in that sense, friend, we can see the role of the civil society groups, the global governance concept, where the non-state actors engaged with the state and the state-centric sort of structured that collaborations and the networking between the state-centric and non-state-centric approach, and their collaborations are become more important so far as to provide or to maintain security in the international system. Friends, now the last dimension to define the conception of security or to understand the conception of global security is the parameters of core values. So in the case of state-centric conception of security, that is the national security, so the state was more important, state values was more important, sovereignty of the state, independence of the state, territorial integrity of the state, and also the freedom of the citizens of that particular state or the nation, and some other core values for that matter the state stood for example, promotion of democracy, protection of human rights, and also the non-racial discriminations. Whatever sort of policies or whatever sort of objective or the philosophy or the values the state is stood for, the state must be in a position to respond or to protect that sort of core values. So the core values in the conception of national security define in terms of the core values of the state. So it was more state-centric core values. But in the case of global conception of security, friends, we also include that the new other dimension of the core values or the values of the other stakeholders, which is not necessarily state, rather the non-state actors as well. And in that sense, we can say it is not the state only, rather the security of the individuals, that we call as the human security, that is equally important, that define the new discourse or the new conception of security that we call as the concept of global security. So friends, in that sense, it is not the core values, it not the protection of the nations, a particular nations, their sovereignty or its territorial integrity, rather the concept of global security. So the global security is basically what? The global security is including the concept of national security that defined in terms of security of the nations as well as the security of the human being. So the global conception of security is the inclusion or the combination of both, that is the national security plus the human security. So in that sense, the core values define not only in terms of the concept of national core values or the core values of the state, rather the core values of the individuals as well. So in that sense, friends, the economic protection, economic rights, individuals' freedom, human rights and food security, environmental security, these all broader dimension of the security is equally important or given equally important in the case of concept of human security. And friends, the concept of global security is what is giving emphasis on the concept of national security, that is the core values of the nation as well as the core values of the human being as well. So that combination of both that define the concept of global conception of security. So friends, in that sense, we see a kind of change which occurred in the international system that defined the international conception of security. So in summary, friends, we can say that the concept of security is a very contested concept in the discourse of international relations, and that concept of international security or the concept of security is very much integral part of the broader discipline that is international relations or global politics. But in order to define the concept of security, that security, whose security matters, in that sense there is a kind of debate and there is a kind of contestation so far as to define the conception of security is concerned. So in that sense, friends, we find that the dominating discourse of the security up to the Cold War period, we find there is a realistic assumption of the security which is based on or which is defined in terms of national security, means that the security of the nation that is paramount, that is important. So that discussion, that discourse has find much place in the discourse and discussion of the security during the Cold War period. So in that sense, friend, we see the core values, the threat and the responsibility, maintaining international peace and security. That responsibility is largely confined or limited to the state. So the state strategy, state-centric conception of security, state goal, state survival, national interest, and the concept of national power, balance of power. These were the example that was largely defined the concept of security in a traditional way, or we call it as the traditional concept of security that was largely applied up to the Cold War period in the international system. But friends, as we discussed in this particular lecture, that the forces of globalization that occurred out of the result of the end of the Cold War and disintegration of USSR, the forces of globalization forced the international thinkers or the expert of international relations or the theories of international relations to come up with new dimension of security, and also they that forced the international relations theories to explain the concept of security in a more comprehensive and in a more broadened way. So these forces of globalizations that resulted in the kind of more integrations, more free flow of people, migration of the people, rapid technological advancement. So because of that reason, the whole globe or the whole international system became a global village. Because of that reason, the limited conception or the narrow conception of the state-centric concept of security now broadened by the including the concept of human security as well. So the human dimension of the security that expressed in terms of economic security of the human being, that expressed in terms of the food security of the human being, that expressed in terms of health security of the human being, that expressed in terms of the environmental security of the human being, cultural dimension of the human being, and also the identity based conception of human security. So that conception of human security become a very important issue in the discourse of debate of international relations, and with the inclusion of new conception of security, that is the human centric conception of security, we find that a broader conception of security that we call as the global conception of security, or that we call as the global security. So in nutshell, the concept of global security is more broadened in nature compared to the concept of national security, that was state centric only, limited to the security of the state, and also the state was the only actor that are there in the discourse of security, international security, in the discourse of global conception of security or global politics is concerned. But the global concept of security more broadened in nature, more comprehensive in nature, and more inclusive in nature by the inclusion of non-state actors that play important role, and that also very important so far as the security, maintenance of the security, or creating instability or insecurity in the nation state system. So the global concept of security include human centric conception of security, non-state centric concept of security, as well as the traditional concept of security, that is the state centric security, and the state as an actor in creating peace and also creating instability in the system. So that global security is much broader in compared to national concept of security by the inclusion of national plus human concept of security. Now friends, that is the basic assumptions or the basic explanation so far as the concept of global concept of security and national security. So in order to explain that concept of global conception of security or the national concept of security, we can take also the examples, or we can take also help the theoretical explanation how theories of international relations look at or explain the concept of global conception of peace and global concept of peace and security and the national concept of peace and security. In this lecture, in the extension of this lecture, friends, we will also have another things to discuss about, or which is related to the concept of security, that the issue of cooperation and conflict. So that issue of cooperation and conflict, we will discuss that things or that issue in detail with the help of various theories, the theories that explain that in what circumstances which is related to the concept of security, where the state can cooperate, and in what circumstances or what are the explanation that where the state will go in a kind of conflicting kind of, or take the conflicting sort of approach so far as to maintain the national security and international security. So that things we will discuss that in detail in the coming lecture, but here what we are trying to do is that we try to take certain explanation of the concept of two dimension of security, national and global security. We try to explain that, or we try to understand that with the help of the three important approaches to international relations. The one important approach to international relations is the realistic approach to international relations. So how that realistic approach to international relations look at the concept of security. As friends, as we know that the realistic approach to international relations, it talks about that state is the primary actors, and the state concern, that is the national interest and the core values of the state, that is the survival of the state and the sovereignty, protection of the sovereignty of the state, that is the only objective of the state, and for that matter state will not take any sort of responsibility which is against the national interest of that particular state, that is the survival and the security of the state. So they are arguing that the state behave in a very selfish manner, state behave in a very narrow manner to protect the national interest of that particular nations, and they also arguing that there is no any sort of common sort of organization, institutions or government that has the capacity to control the selfish behavior of the states, and the security of the state is at the cost of other states. So the concept of that, because of that anarchical situations that happened in the international system, because of that state trying to maximize its own power, that is what the concept of self-help and self-survival. So that concept of realistic approach to international security, that all talks about it is the state, their security, their core values, their survival, that is more important, and no other things, no other things matters. So in that sense, the state would be the state system to provide security or to maintain international peace and security, that will more conflicting in nature. But at the same time, there are various versions of the realistic approach to international relations where state also trying to engage in a cooperative manner to maintain international peace and security as well. So in that context, friends, we can take the example of neo-realistic approach. In the neo-realistic approach to international relations, they talks about the state structure and also the relative concept of gain, and also and also the topics related to the cheatings in the international system. So friends, realistic approach, in the various dimension of the realistic approach, they are arguing that state may engage in a cooperative way in the international system to maintain international peace and security, but at the same time, the concept of relative gain is very important, which means that if the state A is engaged with the international system and the state A think that, or having the perception that in that sort of engagement, other state, maybe B or C, getting more and more secure compared to state A, then the state A would not be in an engaging position, or the cooperative behavior, behave in a cooperative way in the international system. So that cooperation and conflict, that is there, but the realistic assumption to international security, that more talks about in terms of state-centric conception of security, the security of the state, responsibility of the state to maintain peace and and to bring security to that particular nation. It is only the responsibility of that particular state. So the conception of balance of power, concept of self-help and self-survival, enhancement of the national power, the concept of relative gains, these are the basic things that describe the concept of security from the perspective of realistic approach to international security. Unlike that, there is another important theoretical explanation of the international security, that is the liberal perspective to international security. In that, friends, they also having the same point of view similar to the realistic approach with different explanation as well, that the state is important, their security is important, but state will be in a cooperative manner to maintain international peace and security. And for that perspective, state would create an international organization and also international law so that their behavior can be regulated, and international organizations, the adherence of the principles of the international organization, norms of the international organizations, through that matter, they peacefully engage in avoiding any sort of conflict or any sort of similar sort of violence as well. So that cooperations, by channelizing with the help of international law and also international organizations, the state trying to cooperate each other. In addition to this liberal approach to international security, they also arguing that is the new liberal approach to international security. They are arguing that the economic survival or the economic security of the state is equally important. But again, in that sense, the security of the state is important, but that defined more in terms of economy. So the concept of free trade, free commerce, creation of international organization, economic organization like IMF, like that sort of organization, that are there to that will regulate and engage more in a cooperative manner among the state in the international system, and it is to create a kind of environment where the economic prosperity of the all nations can be served. So that is the liberal conception or the liberal way to understand the concept of international security. In addition to that, there is also a kind of democratic peace theory, that is also one of the explanation or one of the way to look at the concept of global security or international security. The authors arguing that, or the exponent of this theory, that is the global peace theory, they are arguing that if there is a promotion of democracy, if the all nations following the liberal democratic models which is adopted by the West, if these countries which are non-democratic in nature, non-capitalist in nature, or having the non-capitalist form of economy, if these states also following that sort of liberal democratic system or liberal democratic model of polity and economic system, then there is a lesser and lesser chance of going to conflict. So there will be a less chance of conflict, and it will enhance more cooperations among the state once the state following the democratic model of governance system and also the economic system based on free trade and commerce, liberalization and globalization. So if the state is following that, then there will be a more cooperation, and there is a more possibility among the state to cooperate and also to maintain international peace and security. Friends, these explanation, that is the liberal approach, the various dimension of the liberal approach to international security, the realistic dimension to look at the international conception of security, but that two basic approaches, which is traditional in nature, classical in nature, are very important to explain international relations as well as international security. These two approaches are largely or limiting that concept of security only to the state conception of security, but the differences between the liberal and the realistic approach to security is that in the case of realistic approach to international security, it is state centric, but the concept of self-help and self-survival, because of the prevalence of the anarchical system in the international system, the state will more engage on the basis of self-help and self-survival, and the cooperation among the state having the lesser and lesser chance to maintain international peace and security or to bring security to that particular nation. But in case of liberal interpretation of international security, that is again state centric in nature, but the state, because to achieve the common objective, that is to maintain international peace and security, they are more in favor of cooperations, and that cooperations with the help of international law and international organization as well. And the new liberal approach, that also giving more importance on the institution which is based on economic engagement of the state in the nation state system, that is IMF and other sort of institution. And at the same time, there is a possibility of the cooperations among the state from the perspective of liberal approach to international security, that is the democratic peace theory, which means that the cooperation is possible, war can be avoided, conflict can be avoided if the nations in the nation state system following the democratic principles of government and also the free trade and commerce based on capitalist system of economy. But as a whole, these two arguments that put forwarded by realistic and liberal approach to international security, the main concern of security or the main basis of the security is the state. Whether the state will cooperate to achieve that security or whether state will go for in a conflicting way to preserve their national interest, that is the differences between the two main approaches to international security. But at the same time, both having the similar argument that it is the security of the state, whether it is the physical existence, territorial integrity or the economic prosperity of the state, that is the another dimension, but it is the state that core values, that security is paramount, and that is the concern of the security that define the international system up to the Cold War period, which means that before the Cold War period and before the Cold War period and during the Cold War period, both two theories of international security explain the state behavior to maintain its own security and to maintain international peace and security. Somewhere the cooperation is possible, somewhere the conflict is there, cooperation is not possible. Friends, the another important theory that defined the concept of security, that we call as the constructive concept of security and the postmodern conception of security. So that critical concept of security, that is the critical theory of international relations, that also define in a different way the concept of security. And as we have already discussed about the concept of global security that emerged after the end of the Cold War. So because of the end of the Cold War and the new forces that emerged in international system because of the forces of globalizations, we see the identity based concept of security, ethnic based concept of security, economic based conception of security, environmental based concept of security, that become equally important, that decide the concept of broader concept of security that we call as the concept of human security or global security. So that concept of human security or the global security, which is more broader in nature, more non-state, state and non-state centric in nature, traditional and non-traditional centric in nature, that define in terms of identity, in terms of culture, in terms of values, norms and humanistic concern, that is the concept of human rights, economic rights and some similar sort of rights. So that new concept of security was defined by the critical concept or critical approach to international security or international relation. So we find that the critical approach to international security and the exponent of that critical approach to international security, like Alexander Wendt and some other scholars who defined that critical approach or to explain the identity based concept of security. So in that sense, friend, this school of thought that is the critical school of thought, it also include the non-state centric concept of security by including the ethnic, identity, cultural based conception of security. So that concept of security is more non-state centric in nature, and it also include the global conception of peace and security. In addition to that, or within the framework of critical concept of security, we also have the dimension of the feministic approach to international security. That feministic approach to international security, they are arguing that the exponent of this school of thought, they are arguing that in the discourse of international relations, or the dynamics of international relations, it is the women that are the main target and that are the main victims of the factors of international security or the global concept of security. So the vulnerable situation of the female or the women in the international system, their interest, their core values, their security is equally important, and that must be given much importance or due importance in the discourse of international security as well. So it is not a state-centric concept of security, rather it is a gender-based concept or feministic-based concept of security, and that also explain the broader concept of security, that is global conception of security. Friends, at the same time, we also have the another explanation or dimension of the critical concept of security. That critical concept, it is the various new non-state concept of security or non-traditional concept of security. We also have post-structuralist and post-modern concept of security as well, where the security concept is not defined in an old-fashioned or traditional concept of security. Rather, they define the concept of security more different way compared to the traditional concept of security. So friends, these sort of theoretical explanation, that is the realistic approach, liberal approach, and the various dimensions of the critical approach, as a whole, we can understand the concept of security. So in the traditional way, that define more in terms of realistic approach or liberal approach to security, state is an important actor, and the state security is important, and how state behave to maintain peace and security in the international system, where the state will cooperate, where the state will go in a conflicting way, that are largely defined by these school of thought. And we also have, because of the process of globalization and the end of the Cold War, new factors emerge in the discourse of international security and international relations. So to explain that sort of non-state centric conception of security, non-military based concept of security, non-traditional based concept of security, to explain that aspect of the thing, there is another school of thought that we call as the critical approach, or the critical approach to international security, or the critical approach to global peace and security. So friends, we will end that lecture now by summarizing the things that what we have done in this particular class. In this class, we discuss the concept of security, why security matters, why it is a contested issues in the international security or in the discourse of international relations, and we also try to explain that through the various dimensions of security, the concept of national security and also the concept of global peace and security, how the process of globalization, how the forces of globalization impacted the older conception of state-based concept of security, and how the concept of security broadened by the inclusion of new factors or the new dimension of security, that the security defined not only in terms of military security, not in terms of state-centric security, rather it is also defined in terms of economic aspect of security, the environmental aspect of security, food and health conception of security. So it broadened the concept of security that we also call as the humanistic concept of security. So the global peace and security is the combination of national security plus the human security, and that we call as the concept of global peace and security. And friends, lastly, we also discuss the theoretical explanation or the theoretical approaches or the concept that explain these various aspects of security. Started with the national, international and humanistic concept of security, and as a whole we can say the global conception of peace and security. To explain that, we also take the help of the new dimension or the new approaches to look at the concept of security with the help of critical approach to international peace and security. Thank you, friends. I hope that we have discussed the things in a large way, and I hope that you understand the topics. And we will meet with new topic related to the concept of security, that is cooperation and conflict in the discourse of international peace and security. Thank you very much once again.